to really dig in and study your word and the history of your faithfulness to the generations before us and the testimony that they have left us. And I pray that we could just give us renewed vision and purpose in our lives as we consider the ways that you have given to us, that you have directed us through your word. Just pray for Dan as he teaches. Just give him wisdom and clarity and discernment as he teaches. And just pray that we would be open to hearing what you have for us. Bless this evening and bless each one in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. It's good to be here again tonight. Good evening to each of you who are here, and also to any people who may be watching via the live stream. The theme for the week I'm calling Challenges and Choices in Mennonite History. And I guess in some ways last night when I was talking, I said a lot of things, but one thing I didn't really say is maybe tying that title into what I was talking about. As we looked at the story of the Anabaptist movement coming to be, there were people, and we looked at some of them by name, many who we didn't mention by name, who faced a choice, or maybe a series of choices. And at the initial time, the challenge that they faced was, how do we live as Jesus' disciples? How do we live what we profess to be, Jesus' disciples? And that was the challenge, and the choices that they made to become to be rebaptized as an adult, for example, choice to follow Jesus' commandments, to love your enemies, to live in peace, even with people who persecute you, rather than resisting them with violence. Choices like that led to persecution. It led to death for some of them. And to follow Jesus and the challenges that life brought to them. And it's the same with us. It's the same with us. We're making choices every day. As life brings challenges, we're making choices, and choice to follow Jesus or not is something that's real for all of us. I'd like to look at some other aspects of challenges and choices this evening, and sort of subtitled this one tonight, America. I'd like to start by reading some verses from Psalm 66. Just a few verses. You don't need to turn there, although you may. I'm going to start reading at verse 8 in Psalm 66. It says these words, the psalmist writes, "O bless our God, ye people, and make the voice of his praise to be heard, which holdeth our soul in life, and suffereth not our feet to be moved. For thou, O God, hast proved us. Thou hast tried us as silver is tried. Thou broughtest us into the net. Thou laidst affliction upon our loins. Thou hast caused men to ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water, but thou broughtest us out into a wealthy place." I'll stop reading there, and obviously we're taking this a little out of context, but I think that for the Anabaptist people in Europe, as we'll see tonight, and the journey that some of them made to America, where we find ourselves today as Anabaptist people, they probably identified with that. All right? We went through fire and through water. All right? The fires of persecution, the water of the ocean, but thou broughtest us out into a wealthy place. We're in a wealthy place tonight. So tonight, what I'd like to talk a little bit about is how we got here. All right? Here we are, Anabaptists, Mennonites, in 2022, and we're in America. And the movement that we talked about last night started in Europe, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the 1500s. So there's a story of how our ancestors, for many of us, our physical ancestors, spiritual forebears as well, made this journey. And I'd like to think a little bit about how that happened tonight. Tomorrow night, what I'd like to look at then is a little bit how there were continuing challenges in living here that the Anabaptists faced, Mennonites and Amish, faced even in America. So hopefully this will be of interest and feel useful. And like I said, it's sort of maybe it's part one of two parts in a way. I mean, if you couldn't make it tomorrow night, it isn't hopefully that you'd say, oh, you only got the first chapter tonight. But anyway, so let's talk a little bit about this, or rather, I will talk and you can listen. There's a habit I have from years as a teacher at Terry Hill Mennonite of saying, let's do this, and I'd say, let's talk about it. But I really didn't want my students to talk most of the time. I wanted to talk, and I wanted them to listen. So, moving to America. When people out. So, before I really get to the specifics for the Mennonites and Amish people that we'll talk about tonight, let's just think about it in modern terms. We have immigrants coming into Lancaster County from Afghanistan. Our congregation, my wife and I are part of Oasis Mennonite Fellowship in New Holland, and a number of folks in our congregation actually are working closely with an Afghan family that they're living in Lancaster now. Why did they come? Why did they pack up and leave their homeland? They were pushed out. All right, presumably they fled fearing for their lives as the government there sort of folded back in August, and they were some of the people who were able to get flights out, and so here they come. They're moving. They're pushed out. We read stories in the news about how there are people coming, attempting to enter our country by, via the southern border. What's going on? What's pushing them out? Well, many of them cite gang violence and things like that. They just say it pushes them out of their homelands. Not that they want to leave, but they feel they have to be safe. So, in the context of the early Anabaptists, we talked about persecution. Persecution, in some ways, did sort of begin to let up about 100 years after the Anabaptist movement started. By 1625, there's not a lot of the same level of persecution going on, but there was still some. And in some of the areas where the Anabaptists lived, particularly the ones that still lived in Switzerland, there was still a level of persecution. They were not paying for their faith with their lives, but they could face exile and other punishments. In some of the cantons or cities in Switzerland, the governments actually were so effective at getting rid of the Anabaptists that there were no congregations. Zurich, where the whole thing started, the whole movement started, by the middle of the 1600s, had basically had no Anabaptists left. The government there had been so effective at getting them all to leave or convert back to the state church, in some cases perhaps. The canton of Bern, which is nearby, was different. The government there was seemingly never quite so effective, and so Anabaptists continued to live there. However, there was continuing persecution on them. In some of the places I talked about last night, this search for havens of toleration in Europe, one of the places a lot of the Swiss Anabaptists moved to early on was Moravia. And a lot of the ones who did that were following an Anabaptist leader named Jacob Hutter. And today the people who are sort of descended from that movement are, usually we call them the Hutterites, or the Hutterian Brethren is sort of their own name. They live in communities, hold all things in common, live some in the Midwestern states, some in Canada today. Another place that a lot of the Anabaptists from Switzerland went was a little bit north, into an area called the Palatinate, on either side of the Rhine River. The leaders there, the leader was called the Elector. The leader there invited them in the mid-1600s because he needed farmers. His land had been devastated by a very long and brutal war called the 30 Years' War that ended formally in 1648. And it devastated huge portions of Germany. And it was essentially started as a conflict between Protestants, Lutherans mostly, and Catholic Germans. And it drew in some of the other countries. And it was an incredibly bad time for the German people. Switzerland escaped that. They weren't part of that war directly. But the Palatinate was an area that didn't have a lot of natural defenses, and so it was sort of, the armies would sweep across generation, decade after decade, a whole generation, and lots of villages were sort of disappeared and people couldn't farm. And the result was that after 30 years of this kind of thing, new leadership comes in and they said, we need to do something. There's areas where it's like the woods have grown up again, the fields are no longer there. And so they basically said, anybody who wants to come and live here and can farm, clear away the brush and the woods and the trees and farm, is welcome. And so Anabaptists got permission to do that. There were restrictions on them. They had to pay extra taxes, and they weren't allowed to openly worship. They had to worship in their homes, and there were limits on how many people could worship in a home. There were all kinds of those things, but they weren't persecuted. The problem with all of those places in Europe is that it hinged on the leadership of that area agreeing to toleration. And of course, when the leadership changed, usually it was hereditary. So when the leader died and maybe a son or a relative took over, the toleration might be revoked. In some places it was. In the Palatinate, they did not revoke it. But they did begin to put limits or more restrictions. And so there was this sense that they're losing toleration. In 1682, the French took over part of that region called the Alsace area on the western bank of the Rhine River. And the king there, and the king of France being a Catholic ruler, imposed that on the Alsace area. So that happened in about 1680s. And so they lost some of their toleration in that area. There's also a sense of overcrowding in some of these areas that they were tolerated because it was filling up. The Anabaptists were now, a second generation was coming, and there were still immigrants coming from Switzerland who were exiled or kicked out from Bern. And it was getting kind of crowded. And the leaders of these places tended to say, well, we gave you land to start with. Technically, the Anabaptists seldom owned it. It was usually not theirs, but they had these long-term leases. And we can give you that land to farm, but you're not really part of our country because you're not part of the right church and you're not taking oaths of loyalty to the leaders. And so they often said you can't have more land. So that kind of led to a crowded setting. The Palatinate, I mentioned, had been devastated by the 30 Years' War. Well, unfortunately, warfare broke out again between the French and some of the Germans in the 1680s and 90s, and then in the early 1700s. Again, there's these repeated wars going back and forth across the area where most of these Anabaptists lived, and they lost a lot in that. And so we have, with all of these things, a definite setting of economic hardship, especially by the early 1700s. And many Anabaptists in that area were starting to think, where should we go? It doesn't seem like we can stay here. That's the early 1700s. The late 1700s, we have this event in France called the French Revolution, and that triggers warfare as well. Pretty much about 20 years, 25 years of warfare in Europe. And in 1792, in the midst of some of that revolutionary time, the French government did something that had never happened before really in Europe in a big way, and that was the idea that they're going to conscript all the able-bodied men into the army. That was kind of a new concept, and it worked for the French in the sense that they won some of their wars. Eventually they didn't, but they did for a while. So a lot of rulers looked at that in Europe and said, that's not a bad idea. Keep our country safer. Let's have an army, even in peacetime. Let's have every man enter the army at least for several years to get training. And military conscription poses a big problem for people who want to follow Jesus' way and say, well, I don't use the sword against my enemies. I love my enemies. All of those are reasons that would tend to push Anabaptists out of Europe. But they could have gone other places. And some of them did, eventually. Some of them went to northwestern Germany. And from there, some of them went to the Russian Empire, in what today is Ukraine, and other places in Russia. And some of them went to the Netherlands and lived there, and just sort of settled there. But America had a certain pull to it. See, a pull factor is where you go. Okay, it's not why you have to leave your homeland, but it's kind of where you decide to go. And so, what were things that pulled people to America? One is religious liberty. We'll talk about the colonial government in America that most of the Anabaptists moved to and lived under said not just toleration by the authorities, that, well, if you pay these extra taxes and follow all these regulations, we'll let you live here. Now, the government here said, if you are a Christian, actually, they didn't even say that. They said, if you believe in God, you're welcome to live here and worship Him according to your conscience. That's what they said in Pennsylvania. Not every colony in America stated that, although most of them did allow a fair degree of religious liberty. Secondly, America has land at very inexpensive rates, but the land needed to be cleared and settled. And then thirdly, we're talking about the conscription and military things. America never had standing armies, peacetime armies. It just never did. And there were wars in America, but they were few and far between and tend to be very short in the colonial era. The big one, the French and Indian War, as we call it, did happen in the 1750s and 60s. But apart from that, they tended to be pretty brief. And even after that, after the Revolutionary War was over and independence, tended to be pretty brief until we get to the Civil War. And so in America, there's not drafts. They didn't do drafts until the Civil War era. And people like our ancestors who, for conscientious reasons, would not serve in the military, found that very appealing. All right, so I've talked a little bit about those things. And I also sort of mentioned the place that pulled a lot of them, all right, and that's Pennsylvania. So in 1681, the English king, Charles II, granted William Penn, a well-to-do English man, land in America to repay a debt that the king had incurred to the Penn family in the years past. William Penn was the son of an admiral in the English Navy, but he himself, as a young man, had become a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, as it was formerly called. And as a Quaker, he strove to follow the teachings of the New Testament, so he did not take up arms either. He wouldn't swear oaths. Other things that made Quakers kind of unique, the Quakers refused to recognize social distinctions between people. And Quakers believed strongly in the inner light of the Holy Spirit. And so they believed that as people follow the light, they will be given more light. And so William Penn, when he was given this land, intended to make his colony, as he called it, a holy experiment. A he wanted to make it a, maybe it's a little strong to say the kingdom of God on earth, but he wanted to get as close as he could. So he said that anybody who wants to live here can, as long as they believe in God. He actually, although he was given this land by the English king, kind of here in the middle of some other colonies like New York and Maryland and Virginia. Delaware was actually part of the Pennsylvania grant at that time, and New Jersey was not, but was a neighboring colony. William Penn also negotiated with the local American Indians, the Lenape or Delaware tribes, and so there was peace in this colony. He plotted out a new big city. Well, it wasn't big, but it was fairly large by colonial standards, and he named it grandly Philadelphia, which is from the Bible. You know, you can read about the Church of Philadelphia in Revelation. It means in Greek the city of brotherly love, and that's what he wanted to his colony to be like, a place of brotherly love. And this colony attracted people from all over. Philadelphia grew to be the largest city in the British colonies. It was larger by far than New York or Boston or some of those other earlier cities, and it became a place with a lot of business and a lot of people. And so this draws in people to come across the Atlantic and settle here. So we have people whose origins are in Switzerland. You have the Rhine River. I mentioned that last night. And this is the area on the east and western sides of the Rhine that we generally call the Palatinate on this side and the Alsace area on this side. And so as this area, like I said, filling up, conflicts and war, people from that area began thinking about moving to another place. Now, I want to take just a couple minutes here. This is sort of dangerous for me to take a couple minutes to do something a little extra, but I think it's important. When the Anabaptists started moving here in the early 1700s, most of them shared a common background: Swiss, Palatinate, Pennsylvania. Switzerland, the Palatinate, Pennsylvania. All right. They tended to be related, tended to intermarry a lot, but they were in two groups. One of them, in America, has typically always used the term Mennonite, and the other has usually used the term Amish. So let's take just a couple minutes to say, this is what happened. In the canton of Bern, it was against the law to be an Anabaptist, but the government never could quite stamp out the religion. In fact, in the late 1600s, 1670s and 80s, there was a bit of a sort of, I guess we might call it a revival among the Anabaptists there. They used the term Anabaptist. Their preferred term was Taufa, which means Baptist in English. And they gained a number of new converts from the state church, one of whom was a tailor whose name was Jacob Ammon. And Jacob Ammon apparently had leadership qualities that eventually were recognized, and he was called to a position of leadership among the Anabaptists. For reasons that we don't, or at least that I don't entirely know, maybe there's some research out there that I haven't read, at some point, probably because of some of the pressure, especially of an Anabaptist convert from the state church like he was, he wound up moving to the Palatinate with his family, which was safer. And he eventually became considered an elder or a church leader there in some of their congregations. Jacob Ammon felt that there would be some ways to improve the lives of some of the Anabaptists. And he said, we really what he was trying to do, I think, in some ways, was trying to say, let's look at the writings of Menno Simons and our confession of faith, and let's live by it. And there were a number of things that he brought up. He wanted to have communion twice a year instead of once a year. He wanted to practice feet washing, which the Dutch Mennonites did, but the Swiss brethren did not. And also, most controversial, he said that he believes that people who are part of the church, but who fall into sin and do not repent, when they're banned from the church, meaning they're excommunicated, that the other people in the church should sort of keep their distance from them, should shun them. The German word, I guess, is Meidung. And you know what? Jacob Amann was right about two things. The Dutch did it. Well, it had caused all kinds of church splits among the Dutch. But some of the Dutch did it anyway, Dutch Mennonites. Menno Simons endorsed the concept. So did the church confession of faith that they were using in that area, the Palatinate, which actually came from the Netherlands too, that the confession did. And so he was promoting this. And eventually he had people who agreed with him, and he had other church leaders who did not. And eventually they tried to settle things, and he went back to Bern to try to work things out with the leadership there. And the sort of senior leader among the church there, the Anabaptists there, named Hans Reist, would not, in modern day terms, he wouldn't give him the time of day. He wouldn't meet with him. He wouldn't talk. When Amann and some of the visitors said, let's have a meeting, some of the other leaders came, but Reist would not come. When they said, where are you? He said, I have to make hay. I mean, it's like, I don't have any time for your church stuff. I'm going to be working in my fields here. It led to a falling out. I think there was probably, I get the sense that there was probably some stubbornness and some hot-headedness and some impulsive and rash decisions on both sides. Hans Reist and Jacob Amann, neither of them, in my opinion, really covered themselves with glory in this whole thing. The result was a split among people who followed Hans Reist and those who followed Jacob Amann. And Amann went back to the Palatinate, okay? But even there, the whole thing followed him, and maybe he actually sort of brought it to a head. I don't know. There's not a lot of evidence in some ways for some of these things, but what we do know is that the people in the Palatinate and in Switzerland sort of all had to make a decision in 1693 and 1694, which side they're on. And the two sides did not get along. I mean, they shunned each other. 5-7 years later, they tried to bring the two sides together. Amann admitted that what he had done wasn't the right approach, and he asked forgiveness and things, but it was, at that point, the two paths seemed to be diverging. And when people came to America, they brought that with them, those divisions. Not entirely. There is some things I've read that do suggest that some of the people, when they made the switch to America, they left that behind them. And some of the people who in Europe would have probably identified as Amish, when they came here, they kind of just blended into the Mennonites. And there's no, and yet eventually we do find people who didn't, and they called themselves Amish. So, I can't do justice to that whole subject in 10 minutes, but I'm going to stop trying. So, if you're coming to America, how do you get there? You move from the Palatinate down the Rhine River to Rotterdam. Rotterdam is a coastal city in the Netherlands. It's a port city, and you found a vessel there. Now, they knew about America because Penn was a Quaker, And the Quaker movement was not just English. They sent missionaries, if that's what the word is, or evangelists, all over Europe. And they evangelized among the Dutch and the Germans. And when they got there, Penn himself did some of these trips. He found that there are people like the Quakers who don't take oaths, and they don't bear the sword, and they kind of dress in a little more of a conservative, old-fashioned way, which Quakers did too. And so there's a lot of connections. Actually, the Quakers found Anabaptists who converted to the Quaker way. There were German Quakers and Dutch Quakers like that who had Anabaptist roots. So Penn was actively recruiting Germans to come to Pennsylvania. And so they had to get on a ship. Now, they boarded an English ship. English meant that the ship had to be registered in England. The captain was English. The officers on the ship had to be English, and a certain portion of the ship's sailors had to be English to be considered an English ship, because it was the law that all the ships that went to America had to be English ships. So they got on an English ship. A lot of the Anabaptists had little or no money when they got to Rotterdam, and they had to pay their fares, and so the Dutch Mennonites helped them out. In fact, it got to be such an issue that by 1710, the Dutch congregation said, let's start a commission and raise money as a group because there are so many of these people coming. They call it their Commission on Foreign Needs, and they helped a lot of people get to America. Now, they were crossing the Atlantic Ocean on a relatively small wooden vessel powered by the wind, which is, of course, a chancy thing as far as how fast and far you go. And life here in America becomes almost impossible. You say, I don't want to live. I want to live here anymore. I don't want to raise my family here. And for some reason, somehow, let's just imagine here. Let's imagine, some reason, somehow, you have the opportunity to take a spacecraft and go to the moon and live there because they're starting a moon colony. NASA's been talking about doing this for decades and they never do anything about it. But let's just imagine, if you go to the moon, you know one thing. It will be almost impossible to come back. Okay? Obviously, they're going to have supplies and you might say, well, that's pretty far-fetched going to the moon. That's probably in some ways what it felt like to these people. The Atlantic Ocean is a wide ocean, and these were not people used to the water. They knew the river, the Rhine River, that was about it. To travel across the Atlantic, which would probably be a trip of several months, very, very iffy. And once you get on land again, the experience of that, being on water like that, for them probably would be about the same as what maybe we would feel if we actually went through space and experienced all that stuff that astronauts do now. Maybe it's a bad analogy, I don't know, but I do know that the written reports of people who made that trip in the 1700s suggested that crossing the Atlantic was a life-changing event. And it led many of them to firmly decide that they would never, ever, ever leave dry land again. Now, when they went on a ship like that, it was in the economic interest of the captains to carry a full ship. And with hygiene the way it was in the 1700s, people did not know much about how diseases spread. And so a lot of times sailors tended to be relatively healthy young men. And as much as possible, if you do a little reading on some of these other colonies, you see in a lot of the other American colonies, that's who was coming over. It was mostly young men trying to seek their fortune. But here we have these Anabaptists coming, and they're moving entire families, women and children, older folks. And in any setting where disease spreads, who's the most susceptible? It's always the children and the older folks. I have something here I found a couple years ago, and it is from a journal. It says, presumably kept by one of the ship's passengers on the Charming Nancy. which was one of the earliest Amish, some of the earliest Amish coming to Pennsylvania, settled in Berks County, were on that vessel. And this is written by a man who's presumably one of those Amish people, but it's anonymous here. So I know what I want to do while I'm doing this. You keep count. I'm going to holding my fingers up, but you keep count on how many people don't make it. All right? So this is what it is. This is just little excerpts, but still. The 28th of June, while in Rotterdam, Rotterdam's still here. They didn't even leave yet, okay? While in Rotterdam, getting ready to start, my Zernbly died and was buried in Rotterdam. The 26th, we got under sail. It's the next day. We got under sail and enjoyed 1.5 days of favorable wind. The 7th day of July, early in the morning, Hans Zimmerman's son-in-law died. We landed in England the 8th of July, remaining 9 days in port. Okay, let me stop there. When they remained in port, it's because they were passengers on the vessel, and they didn't really have any money to get off the boat, but they had to wait until the ship was cleared to go or until they finished getting supplies and all. So they were just kind of sitting on this vessel in harbor, in port. Okay. Anyway, they remaining in port, during which 5, how many fingers do I have up to? 5 children died. Went under sail the 17th of July. The 21st of July, my own Liz Bentley died. Several days before, Michael's Georgely had died. They have this little Lee on the end, I guess in German is sort of like saying Georgie or Lizzie in English. It means affection. On the 29th of July, 3 children died. On the 1st of August, my Hansley died. And the Tuesday previous, 5 children died. On the 3rd of August, contrary winds beset the vessel, and from the 1st to the 7th of the month, 3 more children died. On the 8th of August, Shambian's Lizzie died, and on the 9th, Hans Zimmerman's Jacobly died. On the 19th, Christian Bergley's child died. Passed a ship on the 21st. A favorable wind sprang up. On the 28th, Hans Gossie's wife died. Passed a ship 13th of September. Landed in Philadelphia on the 18th, and my wife and I left the ship on the 19th. A child was born to us on the 20th. Died. Wife recovered. A voyage of 83 days. This man was writing, and his wife was expecting a child on the trip over, and he lost 3 children, plus the child that was born right after they got off the boat. How many people died? 26? I don't know how big that ship was and how many people were, but that's a lot of people. 83 days and 26 deaths. Would I do that? Would I move if I knew it might cost that? I don't know. I love my children. I don't want them to die. They were willing to do that because they felt that the Lord was offering them a place to go, and they said, we can't stay here. We don't want to stay here. And so they went. All right, well, they got here. Pennsylvania was a frontier area. It was really a wilderness. From their perspective, they needed to clear everything to farm. And so they started, and if we look at a map with the counties, the first Mennonites in Pennsylvania in 1863 was at Germantown, which is a little bit outside of the Philadelphia area. That was a group of Germans and one family of which were Mennonites. There were others eventually that came into that region kind of around it. In the next couple of decades, we call that area Skipack or Franconia. And then in 1710, we find some moving to the Pequay settlement along the Pequay Creek in Lancaster County, kind of between Strasburg and Willow Street today. More of them started coming to Lancaster County in 1717 and 1727. Amish started settling Berks County, which is a little bit more off the beaten path. In the 1730s, 1736, 37, their settlement there lasted about 20 years, and then during the French Indian War, they had to abandon it, and so most of them wound up moving into Lancaster and Chester County near the line here, which is where, close to where we are right now. So those kind of become the areas of Mennonite and Amish settlement here in Pennsylvania. Just a little bit here. So this is where the first settlement was in Lancaster County. Here we have Lancaster, Strasburg, kind of in between there along the Pequea Creek. We have that settlement. Number of land, that was a larger group. It wasn't just a couple families. I think there were 8 landowners. And they started spreading out pretty quickly. People eventually move into the area called Earl Township near New Holland, Groffdale. And then a little bit further east here to Weaverland, and then so on. Some of the early grants there. A little bit more north towards Bowmansville, Hammer Creek area, north of Lidditz and Ephrata. West of Ephrata, and even out towards the Susquehanna River then. As they settled in, congregational life was important to Anabaptists. So they began by meeting in homes, and it's believed that the house that the Hers built in the Willow Street area is probably the location of the first Mennonite services in Lancaster County. Of course, in Germantown, they had a congregation meeting there earlier, and some of the other areas between Lancaster County and Germantown. Ministers were called, usually by the use of the lot. Typically, there were 3 varieties, or 4, depending. You had the sort of presiding person who was called the fuladina, the full minister, sort of like a bishop. They didn't use the term bishop. That sounded way too Catholic to them in those days. They didn't like to use that term. And then you have the Dina am Wort. Is that how it's said in German? Something like that, minister of the word. Some of you can chuckle at my attempts to speak German here. And then they would have had deacons. And they, in some settings, had a position that was called a full deacon, which was kind of a senior deacon. Mennonites typically would eventually build a meeting house. Amish typically did not. They just met in homes for a long, long time. But Mennonites began building meeting houses in the 1720s. And eventually, to some degree, Mennonites in an area, and Amish too, would confer with other ministers. In the 1700s already, the Lancaster ministers would do that on an annual basis. That's called the Lancaster Mennonite Conference. A couple decades after that, we have record that the ones in Franconia were doing the same thing. In other cases, they would meet as needed or smaller groups. And there were certainly conferences of ministers among the Amish too, but not typically quite as regularly. Most of the people that moved here were farmers in Europe, and they were farmers here as well. In fact, they were very innovative farmers. One of the things that made them kind of unique is their abilities to clear land effectively. That picture, by the way, is not a Mennonite farm. The picture, the people in the bottom, to me, look like it was a painting of Quakers. But you get the idea of some of the activities on a farm there in the early times. Clearing was a very important part. So what we have here is Anabaptists who had developed very significant agricultural skills in Europe, bringing them here to some of the best farmland in the world, southeastern Pennsylvania. You see, the Anabaptists in Switzerland were a marginalized people. They weren't really supposed to be there. And one of the things that they did to sort of hang on was they tended to move to areas that were very difficult to reach. Of course, you think of Switzerland, it's the Alps, a lot of mountains and valleys. So a lot of them tended to move to areas that were kind of marginal and clear them, the mountainous areas really and they learned how to farm in those settings. Then when they moved to the Palatinate, well, like I said, the warfare there had allowed a lot of woods to grow up, so they learned how to clear woods, and draining swamps and things was something they were used to, because those were the kinds of places they were allowed to live, or could get away with living. And of course in America there's no restrictions on that kind of thing, but they came here, and yeah, there's trees and woods all over the place here. Big trees, which is a sign of fertile soil, but you have to clear them off. Anabaptists were some of the first Germans to get here. And Anabaptists and the Amish and Mennonites, the Brethren, and some other groups too, only ever made up maybe 10% of the Germans that came here. Most of the Germans were Lutherans. Some were Reformed, some were Catholic, some were Quakers. But the Anabaptists tended to be some of the first ones, and they worked really hard at clearing land, and their farms became very, very valuable then, because they were clearing good land. Another thing they did, they used natural fertilizers, particularly manure. Now, most of us take it for granted that you're going to spread manure in fields. All right, I'm not a farmer, but I grew up around farm. My father was a farmer for a while, and this is what you see. Nowadays, it mostly seems to be subbed out to contractors who specialize in spreading, but it used to be, every farmer, I guess, spread manure. We think that's normal. It was not normal in Europe. It really wasn't. A lot of peasant farmers in Europe thought of manure as simply waste product, and they'd make a pile of it in the meadow and keep adding to it. They didn't put it on fields. It was too much work, and what would be the point? It's just waste. And Mennonites and Amish farmers said, that's not waste. Put it on your fields and your crops will be better than ever. Anabaptists gained a reputation in Europe for being master farmers, like scientific farmers, and they were even asked in some later times to educate others on how to be effective farmers. So here they came, and they said, and they developed skills or knowledge about crop rotation. They did livestock farming, and livestock farming, of course, if you have livestock, you're going to have manure, and that kind of feeds this cycle of having animals to produce manure, to put on your fields, to grow crops that feed yourself, feed your animals, and make a living. And that's it's a cycle. Also, livestock farming produces a little more steady income. You can sell your eggs and your milk. You could sell swine or pigs for meat, things like that. So livestock farming is important. Mennonites became known as experts in breeding animals and even veterinary medicine. In Europe, in some places, Mennonites were not allowed to buy the land they farmed, but they were allowed to buy animals. So sometimes that's what they did. They said, well, we'll buy animals, we'll buy horses, and we'll buy pigs, and we'll buy cattle, and they changed the way people farmed. It's interesting to me, even though I'm not a farmer. Improved implements and eventually diversified occupations in a setting like this. Not everybody wound up staying a farmer. Sometimes people did other things related to farming, usually, maybe run a mill or something like that. And so what we find here, as the land was cleared, Mennonite farms became very profitable. Mennonites began building large, substantial structures, like this is the John Herr Mill, I believe in Lancaster County. This is the Rittenheisen Barn down in Germantown, or a house. It's the Herr House, Christian Herr House, which is the oldest building still standing in Lancaster County. It's a sign of wealth. It really is. Compared to a lot of other Pennsylvania settlers, the Mennonites and Amish were prosperous, especially some of the Mennonites who got here first. And they began to spread out. We don't have a lot of time to talk about all the details here, but you think of this westward expansion, all right, in the Conestoga wagon. We know where Conestoga is, right? It's a Lancaster County invention. In fact, it's probably a Mennonite invention. The Conestoga wagon was the tractor trailer of the 1700s and the 1800s, before trains were invented. And even after trains were invented, because it took a long time to get railroads laid. All right, and so people who were, drovers would go and they'd move merchandise. These weren't wagons for transporting people. It was merchandise, inventory. So they'd head out from here, Philadelphia, Lancaster, Reading, head west to cross the Susquehanna to Mechanicsburg, and then from there they could go north towards New York, or they could hit the big trail, Cumberland Trail, heading south into Virginia and North Carolina. You know why they called it Mechanicsburg? That was like where all the people who fixed wagons were like living there, because this is the station from which people all moved. So if your wagon broke down, you took it to Mechanicsburg. Anyway, it's fascinating to me, maybe not to you, but as we think about that, Anabaptists who start here in, even in colonial times, who sort of start here in southeastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, Berks County, move even in the 1700s to like Juniata and Mifflin counties, in the central part of the state, west of Susquehanna, Franklin County. A little further west, Amish families go to Somerset and then Fayette counties in the years right before the American Revolution. Also, we have Mennonites moving to what today is called Rockingham County, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, and Washington County, Maryland. So they're sort of following here the Appalachian Mountains, and in some cases even going across. And then after the United States gains independence, 1776 to 1783, the conflict there, they moved to other places as well, from what I'm calling sort of the heartlands here in southeastern Pennsylvania and Maryland and Virginia and then western PA there in Somerset County in that area. So they start to move to other places too. Some went to Ontario, to Niagara County, Waterloo County, York County. We have Mennonites moving there, and then eventually Amish coming from Europe directly to that area too. We have some moving to Ohio, today Holmes County and some of the surrounding counties like Wayne, very heavily populated by Amish, but there were Mennonites there too. Fulton County there in the northwestern corner. We have Sioux moving into Indiana, Elkhart and LaGrange there on the border with Michigan, Clay County. New York State, Niagara and Erie counties gained some, and Illinois, Tazewell County in the center of the state, and Joe Davies in the northwestern corner, and then also Lee County, Iowa. All that's before the Civil War. You have congregations emerging. In some cases, these are people who maybe originally settled in the East Coast and then moved, or their children moved, or their grandchildren. Starting in the 1800s, we have Mennonites and Amish coming directly from Europe to the Midwest, or to New York in some cases, and also Waterloo County in Ontario. They were the more or less the conservative Anabaptists in Europe who were against military conscription. When the wars finally ended and Napoleon was defeated in 1815, the next number of years, next several decades, a lot of Mennonites who didn't want to give up their convictions on non-resistance moved away. Some of them moved to Russia, where they were promised toleration on that, which was eventually taken away. More of them moved to America. So what we see here, maybe we ask the question, is this success? And that's kind of where I'm going to end here tonight. Think about this. There's a certain degree of prosperity here that gathers over time. Not every individual person is wealthy. Not every Mennonite is wealthy just because. But this is the sort of general pattern of our people. They worked hard. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, right? Hard work leads to material wealth. If you're hardworking and you're frugal and you're responsible with your income, you're going to gain wealth. it's probably true of people in all cultures, is that wealth generates respect socially. Okay? It's kind of hard to disrespect a rich man, right? Now, maybe some of us would say, well, I don't really respect Jeff Bezos that much. He's the guy that owns Amazon. Maybe you don't, okay? But there's a lot of people that do respect him because he's wealthy, I guess. So, on a smaller scale, though, we tend to respect wealthier people, and that leads to positions of prominence in local communities. So, as they became prosperous, they became respected. As they got respected, they were even, in some cases, kind of pushed to become, prominent people in their communities. And so, what's interesting is that the disreputable outcast Anabaptists of Switzerland, calling themselves here Mennonites or Amish, same dynamic, they have become honest, respected, solid Mennonite and Amish citizens, invited and even pressured to take leading roles in their communities. Right? And that's sort of an interesting thing to think about. Because in Europe, they were bad citizens, and nobody wanted them. And that really didn't change in Europe until the middle of the 1800s, and then it changed primarily because the Mennonites in Europe were willing to give up everything that made them unique, or just about everything that made them unique. They still practiced adult baptism. But by the middle of the 1800s, most of the European Mennonites no longer non-resistant. They didn't really take that part of their teaching seriously anymore, and while some individuals were, by and large the churches weren't. But here in America, where they had never been citizens of any repute before, now they're suddenly held up as good people. These are the kinds of people we like in America. Anabaptists were not frowned on, they were respected. And Mennonite men in Lancaster County served as roadmasters, public school trustees, bank directors, township supervisors, I think even county commissioners. Some of them got involved in politics or were asked to be involved. And in some ways, it hasn't entirely changed as much, maybe. So here we are today in 2022. I live in East Earl Township. My township supervisor's last names are Groff, Fox, and Souter. I don't know if any of them, I shouldn't say it, I don't know that all of them are Mennonites. I know one of them is, the Souter is. He was one of my students at Terry Hill, Mennonite High School. The township, not the township, our representative for this area in Harrisburg is David Zimmerman. No relation of mine that I'm aware of, at least not close, but a man who's a member at a Mennonite congregation. We're represented in Congress by Lloyd Smucker, whose parents at one point were Old Order Amish, I understand. And so in some ways that dynamic has followed us to some degree. It's as if these people who were sort of kicked out of their homes wound up moving here and finding eventually the other people in America saying, "Great, come on, we like having you around. You're good people. You're citizens here. You're citizens here." Now, what we want to think about tomorrow night is what happens when your citizenship in the USA and your citizenship in the kingdom of God come into conflict. Because that happened. They made a lot of choices. It was a challenging situation. But if you're going to follow Jesus, the challenges and the choices will be part of your life. And we'll look at that tomorrow night. Thank you very much for your attention tonight. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here.